Yes, I am ready to begin. Thank you so
All
much,
right.
Dr. Coyne.
Thank you. Take it away, Dominique.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all my committee in their entirety, and a special thanks to the Vincentian Foundation and all of my study participants. At first, I'd like to begin by asking you to review the abstract that's on screen, and then just please indicate to me when you are done reading it or finished reading it, and then I can move on to my next slide.
Okay, I think we're done. You can continue.
Wonderful. Thank you. So to begin, for some geographical context, Quezon City is a part of Metro Manila, and Manila is the capital city of the Philippines. Quezon City itself can be described as a densely populated urban area. Homelessness is a global issue, and overall more empirical research is needed to study the phenomenon across cultures. Specifically, homelessness is understood in the Philippines by many as inadequate housing or houses located in danger zones, such as in parks, mangrove fields, or on the street. This also includes any temporary or emergency housing, as well as any non-suitable or non-sustainable housing. Throughout its history, the Philippines has really undergone many natural disasters, political changes, corruption, as well as instability. And the current socio-political dynamic still includes extreme poverty and corruption. It's important to note that the government still struggles with implementing and coordinating assistance programs, and this has caused ongoing challenges for the Filipino people, including higher prevalence of housing instability, food insecurity, unstable living conditions, and lower socioeconomic status, which all have an impact on social mobility and human capital. Quality of life, or QoL, as a concept really measures the perceptions of personal situations, and it first appeared in 1947 and was defined by the World Health Organization as a state of social, mental, and physical well-being. This definition is pretty inclusive and continues to evolve to include subjective human experiences of health. In this study, QoL will serve as a proxy to study the satisfaction of life domain scale, or the SLDS. And this is used to assess domains of life satisfaction. So looking at things such as life, work, relationships, responsibilities, activities, and social supports. And for my study, it was used to conceptualize how the unhoused individuals in Quezon City, Philippines perceive their total well-being. The overall purpose and significance of my study was to start to really build a numerical foundation for the discussion of the impact of poverty and the lack of sustainable and safe housing on human well-being. And again, little was known about how QoL and satisfaction is assessed in members of this specific population. The central question that guided my research was as follows: to what extent do the variables of socio-demographics, use of support services, shelter, accommodation, and health status contribute to the perceptions of quality of life and satisfaction among unhoused individuals in Quezon City, Philippines? And then additionally, I had two hypotheses. And the hypotheses, the first one was to look at the statistical significant relationship between QoL and satisfaction and whether or not there would be a significant relationship. And the second hypothesis was to look at variables including socio-demographics, use of support services, type of shelter accommodation, and health status, and whether or not there would be a significant relationship in terms of QoL and satisfaction. The next several slides will go over highlights from my literature review in support of my research. Three major themes really emerged throughout the literature, and those included poverty, housing instability, and QoL. Almost 18 million people in the Philippines struggle to afford food, medical care, and housing shortages typically have affected those amongst the poorest populations. And historically, purchasing a piece of land or owning a home has been very difficult for Filipinos. In the Philippines, poverty and housing insecurity, either combined or singularly, have contributed to the type of homelessness, the duration, and the frequency of occurrences. And in the context of the Philippines, any breakdown in social safety nets or social supports, either in the community, the government, or the family, might contribute to difficulty accessing basic supports and housing that people need. In the context of a cultural study in international psychology, it's very important for me to note that there is no universally agreed upon definition of homelessness. So it's important because if organizations, governments, or agencies are all defining homelessness differently, this could result in questions about whether the available data accurately and comprehensively demonstrates the scope or magnitude of this social issue. In terms of QoL, few studies again have focused on QoL and homelessness population using such profiles of mental illness, housing status, and disability status, as well as other socioeconomic factors. QoL, as measured through the SLDS, hopes to provide a context for someone or a group experiencing homelessness when considering factors such as lack of sustainable, stable housing, lack of education or community family support, income disparities, unemployment, and any abuse or violence. So the next several slides will speak to my methodology for the study. The study is a quantitative approach to study the phenomenon of homelessness in Quezon City. This approach allowed me a more comprehensive understanding of the experiences of homelessness within an international context and to study the data in an urban environment. My study was inspired by a 2019 study out of Quebec, Canada, Gentile et al., and served to prime the SLDS measure in this population and staying true to the scope of the quantitative study to determine whether this type of information would also be gleaned in the Filipino cultural context. For this study and the previous study, the quantitative methods were used to study how being unhoused affects someone's quality of life. And both studies use a quantitative research approach to produce objective data that could be studied through numbers, statistics, and then scientifically replicated by someone else. The scope of my work was really led by the Gentile study, 2009 study out of Quebec. And so if I choose to do any future research in the future, this can serve as a starting point. QoL was measured using a modified SLDS, and the domains once again covered 8 domains of life satisfaction. So with friends, family, work, daily activities, support service options, and finances, as well as what others think of the individual. Socio-demographic variables again included age, sex, criminal record, number of homelessness episodes, type of accommodation, clinical and service use variables. It's important to note that QoL has been used across North America and Europe to measure in health-related fields to measure mental and physical health outcomes amongst patients and clients. To provide additional context, I would like to say that the Vincentian Foundation, whom I partnered with for my research as a philanthropic and religious organization, has a long history of successfully purchasing land and constructing homes for families displaced by man-made and natural disasters. And that was done in part through savings mobilizations and land acquisitions since the late 1990s. So in terms of sampling, I employed a snowball sampling method, which involved word of mouth through the foundation's clients. A G-power analysis guided my sample size choice. And then in terms of inclusion criteria for participants, it was adults over the age of 18, both males and females, residents of Metro Manila who without permanent housing, English and Tagalog speaking, and data was collected electronically and translated. The calculating tool, again, was G-power analysis, and there was an estimated 107 voluntary participants needed, and Cohen's, or the effect size, was based on a 0.5 effect size and a 95% confidence interval. I would like to note that besides snowball sampling, in the future, I would consider other sampling methods such as convenient sampling or purposive sampling for a more reflective and effective recruitment strategy. And it's also important to discuss that any emergency housing or temporary housing is not permanent housing or home ownership. So these residents were included in my sample. A translated and back translated version of the SLDS scale was used. It's a semi-structured questionnaire, which included, again, the 11 demographic questions and the 8 questionnaire items. And data collection occurred in a semi-private area at the agency site and was administered by myself and the site manager. And each interview did not last more than an hour. Likert scale questions were used to determine the meanings and perceptions of QoL among Filipino street dwellers and its appearance in their lives. And I managed my bias as a researcher with continued emphasis placed on participant experience. QoL, once again, was the proxy, and specific factors of QoL with emphasis on human satisfaction guided the questions. So for example, questions like, are you satisfied with your family and friend relationships? Are you satisfied with support programs in your area? Are you satisfied with what people think of you, your responsibilities, things of that nature? And demographic questions asked about the participant's sex, age, access to food, or access to medical care or a doctor. To analyze this data, SPSS was used to determine frequency distributions of categorical variables of QoL and satisfaction. And then I also ran regression analyses to examine the relationship between satisfaction and QoL scores. Before anything began, I did receive IRB approval before any data collection, and Father Gerald and I worked as collaborators. And then I was also in contact via phone, email, and video to request any additional assistance and permission resources with the agency. And then participants were asked to take a demographic questionnaire and a QoL questionnaire, and informed consent was asked before participation. As a researcher, I made it my job to be aware of any technological, language, or web issues by ensuring that there was an interpreter and access to Wi-Fi and technology via hotspot internet connection. And the participants were able to take the questionnaire with the help of the interpreter and ask questions. All data was encrypted and secured. And the transcribed questionnaires were able to be reviewed by the participants before final submission, and if they had any questions for clarification. Following the review, the questionnaire was submitted electronically, and participants were not a part of any of the editing or final analysis or results. When I was looking at some of my limitations and delimitations, language and communication were the 2 major barriers, and I accounted for this in the translation and back translation and facilitated item endorsement virtually, working with the interpreter. The second part of what I encountered was a diversified recruitment strategy for sampling and a sample size in a homogeneous group. So my sample size can generally be the sample size can be impacted by the ability to generalize outcomes of the study. At minimum, for a regression model having 1 independent variable, the sample size should be about 107. My sample size was 123 participants total. There was a lack of diversity in my sample. So when I look at things like my control variables, the majority of my participants lived in a temporary housing and a home was the type. Well, 5 lived in an apartment and 4 lived in other. So there was little comparison in terms of my hypotheses. So in the future, a longitudinal study could have better highlighted the causal relationship between QoL and the selected independent variables. And then lastly, in terms of COVID-19 and the technology, any technical issues like bad web connection and cybersecurity, especially around confidentiality, were accounted for by having names and signatures not being collected for anonymity, and data was password protected and owned and accessible only to me as a researcher. So as we get into the first table, this presents here in our results, the frequency and percentages for the categorical variables in this study. So just over 10% of the respondents were male and over 84% were female. And the participants' ages ranged from as young as 19 all the way to 73 years old. Participants lived in different temporary and permanent housing situations, but the majority were living in temporary housing, just over 70%. When examining clinical variables, just over 66% of the participants had not experienced any mental health or substance abuse issues. And upon further analysis of the service use variables, I did find that well over 80% of respondents reported not having a medical doctor or medical access, while 76% of respondents did report having access to food and meals. So results from this study indicated how homelessness and housing instability appears in this population to affect women. So further studies on that could be quite beneficial. Secondly, the use of temporary housing and the efforts to move towards more long-term sustainable housing could also be studied in further research. Thirdly, access to doctors and medical care to treat infections and preventable conditions among the unhoused in the area is an area of concern in a future study. And then lastly, overall QoL in terms of looking at social exclusion and the negative coping skills that someone who is homeless could also be discussed and further researched. So again, the average age of participants in the sample was about 44 years old. In terms of quality of life, the average score was a 1.52 out of a potential 4 on the QoL items, ranging from 1 to 4. And the dependent variable satisfaction has a mean of 3.65, indicating that satisfaction leaned towards satisfied in the sample on the SLDS. This third table indicates the results of my multiple linear regression to examine the relationship between QoL onto satisfaction. Model 1 examines the direct relationship between quality of life onto satisfaction. However, the omnibus F test was not statistically significant, suggesting that this was not a strong model. Furthermore, the R-squared value showed only 7.7% of the variation in satisfaction can be explained by the one independent variable of quality of life. Quality of life as a binary variable was also non-significant. This final table shows you that I did in an attempt to kind of explore why QoL was non-significant. I ran some exploratory results and the items were examined individually on the dependent variable of satisfaction. Similar to the results found, both models 1 and 2 were not statistically significant via the omnibus F test. So the decomposition of the individual independent variables was not needed. Looking into my hypotheses and the results there, the first hypothesis sought to examine the relationship between QoL and satisfaction. Again, the direct effect of QoL on satisfaction did not render statistically significant results. Therefore, I was able to, the null hypothesis was accepted. The rationale for this outcome that I came up with is a small sample size and a small effect size. Additionally, the second hypothesis, which looked at socio-demographic variables, also did not render statistically significant results. So a large portion of this sample being temporarily housed definitely could have impacted the homogeneity of the sample. And then additionally, participant recruitment may not have yielded a robust sample. So the major takeaway for me is one step or one scale was simply not enough for such a complex issue to prove significance. This study served to prime the SLDS instrument in this population, and this has set the stage for any future studies and a methodological change where a qualitative approach or a mixed methods approach could be used in the future. In terms of literature and international psychology, it's important to note that I did, it was inspired by and leaned heavily on the Gentile study out of Quebec, 2009. And my goal with my results of this study was to aim to inform any future research in the psychological impact of homelessness in terms of QoL. and really inform any intervention strategies that may be developed to provide a contextual dimension of the impact of poverty, specifically in the Philippines. The results of this study were designed to contribute to scientific literature and engage policy and stakeholders from global organizations such as the UN, UNICEF, World Health Organization, the Borgen Project, and the APA in their work. And additionally, any education, workshops, trainings, and seminars can really be a part of supporting clients and educating the public. Ultimately, it is more affordable and economical to offer preventative care and stable housing long-term for clients compared to the expense of emergency room visits and emergency temporary short-term housing. Responsible contributions, when I looked at this, it's also important to know that with my study and the 2009 Gentile study, that both looked at different type of accommodations in terms of emergency shelter, temporary housing, and permanent housing. So both studies provided relevant insights into the aspects of homelessness and their associations with QoL while identifying differences among groups. So with that in mind, I think that greater efforts are needed to house people who are likely to experience homelessness on a more long-term basis. And psychologists can work to better understand attitudes and social exclusion often associated with homelessness in terms of bringing people back into full participation in society. It is also important for me and also for a global learning community to understand how and why people enter homelessness and how they survive and exit it as well. I think this involves examining any social supports and safety nets, and the transition process from housing instability to housing stability is especially crucial. I believe international psychologists can be involved in participative action research by working in partnership with communities to challenge inequitable social structures and promote social change for people and communities through long-term sustainable housing, medical care and access, gender equity, and then improving QoL across vulnerable populations. Another major takeaway for me in terms of my recommendations and my conclusions would be more differentiated methodologies could be used to collect data determining the impact of homelessness on certain groups, so prevention and eradication can be facilitated better. International professionals can develop and offer culturally informed interventions with a cultural context in mind, and international psychologists specifically can raise awareness of the phenomenon, serving as consultants and incorporating findings from my study within multiple disciplinary teams and work with local organizations and governments. Both my study and the Gentile study saw a better understanding of QoL in different unhoused groups and situations, and may help to inform policy and service planning, which helps to better respond to the needs of a client-focused healthcare system that is responsive and aware of group differences due to culture. Thank you. This concludes my formal presentation. I will now take comments and questions.
Okay, so now we invite the committee to come back, and I turn it over to Dr. Coyne and Dr. Perez to lead us in 20 minutes of question and answer, and then they will open it up to the general public. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Luter, and thank you very much, Dominique. That was lovely. I was timing you, and you made it in the right amount of time, just as we practiced. So very nice, and you were able to address all the points that you and I had brought up earlier. And because I believe that you and I have both reached a point of saturation, I've been eager to listen to Dr. Perez's take on this. So what I'd like to do is lead with her line of questioning, and then I'll follow up with mine, if that's all right. So Dr. Perez, could we start with you?
Of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Coyne. Dominique, thank you so much. As you know, because we've been on this journey together, I'm just so thrilled that you decided to do your dissertation in my home country. I mean, I'm a little biased. So as you know, right, I mean, I am from the Philippines. I was born in Quezon City. We've had students who've done field experiences in the Philippines, and I think there's at least one student here, Yolanda, who has been, who's done a field experience in the Philippines virtually. So there's a lot of synergy, and the Ascension Foundation, we know, has been also through the contact from Father John Era, who is one of our former IP PhD students. So anyway, with all that being said, I do have questions, really some recommendations, which will count as some final feedbacks for your final written portion too,
Okay.
or things to consider. Forgive my sense here too. Okay, so number one, I think that I don't remember whether or not you've included this, but I think it would be helpful to anchor on a macro level, potentially the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of maybe number 3, which is good health and well-being. Just to, anchor it maybe. I mean, obviously, Dr. Coyne, you can definitely outrule that, but I thought it would be a nice addition for an international psychology dissertation, or the Sustainable Development Goal 10, which is reduced inequalities. So I think number 3 actually matches that best in terms of striving for good health and well-being, which includes the homelessness population. So that's number 1. The other thing too is that I think maybe in the write-up, or just for, you probably know this, but I know you had one slide for it. Limitations and delimitations are 2 separate things. So limitations is out of your control, you're not in control of it, and delimitations is you're in control. Okay, so when you think about that and you report out on that, just make sure that you're very clear, because sometimes people lump both of those together and it's not really the same thing. All right, so that's number 2. So the other stuff that I'm going to be asking is really related to the Philippine context and how you're actually providing that written and your understanding orally, and 2, your methodology. Okay, so those are the 2 areas that I'm going to be asking you questions now.
Okay.
So number 1, how do you feel like the Canadian study is related to the Philippine context?
Thank you. So that's a good question. Really, for me, the Canadian study was what inspired my research, or me wanting to examine the Philippines, recognizing that the Canadian study, French Canadian study, and the Philippines, obviously they are 2 very different cultures. So I took that into consideration in terms of, I was not going to, copy and paste what they necessarily found in Canada and replicate that or find that in the Philippines. Obviously, because when talking about the Philippines, we're talking about a generally collectivistic culture. We're talking about a culture, very close-knit family-wise. We're talking about things like maybe religion and faith play a role, resiliency. So really, the Canadian study inspired my work, but I did not go into it expecting to duplicate or find exactly what my Canadian counterparts found in Canada. Because again, Quebec is a different city, different, sample size. And again, while we were looking for similar things, I did, obviously very crucially know that this is 2 different populations. So definitely more so it inspired my work. But yeah, I very knew going in that I was going to experience something different in my findings.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's perfect. Just make sure, in the final write-up, and I'm sure the whole committee will see your final write-up after all of the edits, to make that very clear. So there's nothing, there's no assumptions in the middle of it. So that's great. I know that in your chapter 5, you said maybe a mixed methods or a qualitative study. How did you decide on landing on a quantitative study as opposed to the other 2? I know that you recommended that potentially, the next iteration might be either one, but how did you land on quantitative?
Absolutely. Very much rooted in that Gentile study out of Quebec. They used a quantitative method. So again, inspired by them. And that's something that I wanted to really trial run in a Filipino context, was a quantitative method, particularly looking at priming this use of the SLDS. So I wanted to see how that would look what results that, could come of that, looking at it quantitatively. So looking at the, statistical data, objective data, numerical data, is something that I was really driven in seeing. While I know I did not render statistically significant results, I am glad that I did it this way, because I feel like I still learned a lot, and a lot could be, gained from looking at it quantitatively. And if anything, it informed me that, okay, going forward, I want to look at this qualitatively. And it better supported that because I have this quantitative foundation now, and looking at something mixed methods in the future.
Right. So when you say inspire, so my understanding, or actually the way that I would write it, I'm not you, obviously, but when you say inspire, that doesn't necessarily mean, just from my point of view, that you would replicate it. That would be like the replicate or have the same methodological style or the design. I would think that you're just inspired by the overall thought of what they did, and not necessarily choose the same methodology. So I guess that was what I was really asking, of how the Canadian article is related, because then you just answered that question as far as like how you're positioning of how you actually use that article to ground the quantitative and to ground your study here. So I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Okay, great. Okay, so my next question is, good job for telling me about the collectivistic nature of the Filipino people. I'm just wondering about your results. Okay, so, and there's a lot that I can say about this. I'm wondering a lot of things, and you could just answer however you want. I'm wondering whether or not the quality of life measure, okay, and I think I asked this in chapters 1 through 3, like what was your Cronbach alpha for this measure for a Filipino population, or really any other population that's not European or Western, and wonder, okay, so that's number one, right? That's number one, whether it's a fit, okay, whether that's a fit.
Right.
Because how we define potentially, right? I don't know if you took IP 798 and you read some of Enriquez's work, or maybe you did, when you took the micro-credential, in terms of contextualizing the Filipino experience. Part of that experience is life, right? Like it's like how they live and how they conceptualize things. So I'm just wondering, okay, so the Cronbach alpha for the quality of life measure for any developing country. So that's number one. Number two, how you contextualize from a Filipino standpoint, what is quality of life and what is life satisfaction? Because I'm wondering whether your results, right, because potentially it's not aligned, or you didn't, I don't know if you captured all of that and contextualized that in chapter 2, whether or not, right, that actually was captured and how they answered. Because from a Filipino standpoint, there's this thing called hiya, which is a Tagalog word for embarrassment, right? So how they answer, they have to think about whether they're embarrassing themselves by reporting out to you, and then also how it may sound to others, even though you say it's confidential. They may think, right? They may think, and I'm trying to put this in Filipino context, they may think that that even though you had a pseudonym or whatever for the participants, that it might go somewhere. It might go to an authority, right? It might go to Dr. Coyne, and she says like Trish goes to this, even though you've said all of these things, right? And that leads me, and I know I'm talking a lot, this leads me to think about the whole colonizer mentality. So of how they're answering the question, right? From the Spaniard colonizer 400 years, and then whether or not the measure, right, and how you've operationalized, right, based on the measure and the words that they use, I don't know. Anyway, so those are all of my wondering. So if you could, I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, no, thank you. I'm very grateful you brought up Enrique as well. And we had discussed it, and it come up in my literature review and also through discussions with Father Gerald, that there is that possibility and in all likelihood of, basically, trying to save face. I had talked about this with Father Gerald in terms of the responses of trying to save face, as you were mentioning, not wanting to show embarrassment, not wanting to be embarrassed. So I definitely not only was aware of that, but as I was looking at my results and, why they were not statistically significant, or, the accuracy of the measure and its validity, that is something I definitely considered because of that. Because again, the cultural context of, applying a measure that was used in maybe North America, in Europe, in an Asian setting, in an Asian context. So I think for myself, definitely going forward from my results and what I learned, the measure itself really, I started the process of priming it and trying to use it. But I think going forward in the future, should I choose to continue this research or anyone else, I would love to see it more rooted and come, more grounded in Filipino psychology and more rooted in, Asian, literature and psychological thought of well-being. And as you mentioned earlier, well-being, in terms of the Filipino culture, from what I learned through my research and talking with you and Father Gerald, is so rooted in family and often faith and often the community. And so those are things that I would definitely want to highlight more in any future, instrumentation. But then also, it explains, I think at least partially my results, and kind of maybe those things were not as highlighted or picked up by the SLDS in this form, in this cultural context. But certainly all valid points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for bringing up those points. And I think your limitation section in chapter 5 could highlight just everything that you said. I mean, all of those things that you just said, with potential actual examples like language, right? Like Tagalog, being in the Philippines, because, we are, COVID has been lifted and all of that. It's not a, worldwide emergency anymore. That would have gathered different results, right? They, them seeing you on Zoom, that there's just some nonverbals that could have been picked up on and things like that. But yes, so that's all I have. I mean, I could ask a whole bunch more, but that's all I have for now, Dr. Coyne. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perez.
Thank you, Dr. Perez, and thank you, Dominique, for walking us through this. I'd like to, first of all, going off of what Dr. Perez brought up about not wanting to save face and wanting to present one's best appearance, I'm actually wondering if you would talk a little bit about, would your presence in the Philippines have impacted positively or negatively this tendency? Or I'm wondering, just because I don't know, was there some aspect of Zoom that would have enhanced one's desire to do or to come across as being stronger than they really are in their, financial footing or their housing footing, or even their satisfaction with life? Or would that come out more readily if you were present in front of them face to face? I wonder this because we don't know, because you weren't there face to face. And, for me, that will always be an unknown. The difference between a data collection, when you can do it as the data collector face to face, or if you're going to be reliant on other means for your data collection, whether it be another person by proxy or along the virtual lines. So, that does remain a question for me. And as I go back and I look at your participants, because I always like to go back to your participants, in your sample, I can characterize the typical respondent as being a female in temporary housing with no reported mental health or physical illnesses, who have a doctor and they have access to meals. They live in a house, although temporarily, and they're saying they're satisfied with their lives. So what does that tell you about the type of question that you're answering, and the line of the line of research that you would hope that your dissertation would belong to?
Absolutely. So to kind of answer the first part of your question, in terms of like virtual studies and research versus in person, that will be, I guess, a question I will always have in terms of this is my initial, venture into this area of research, and then obviously my first dissertation, and my initial venture into research in the Philippines. Obviously, now with this kind of, starting as my foundation, I of course will go to the Philippines. I want to go to the Philippines and really, not only just experience the culture, but look at this research in the context of actually being in country. And getting to meet, my collaborators and Father Gerald and Father John and, those at the foundation, in person. In terms of how that impacted my research and my findings, I definitely think there was an impact. Now, to what degree is up to, interpretation or debate. I do believe that, Zoom can work either or. It can work in the advantage of maybe some people prefer the physical distance, and then obviously there's conversations about privilege of having internet connection and being able to connect to something like a Zoom, and is it distant, is it cold? So all of these are valid concerns and questions to ask, versus if I would have been in person, and would that have maybe made it less intimidating versus a camera? Would it have been an issue that I don't speak Tagalog? Would it have been an issue for any other reason, my physical, presentation, or my voice, or my dialect? So a number of factors that are all, worthy to consider, and I'm glad you asked the question. And in terms of, again, saving face and things of that nature, I really believe that, my study just kind of scratched the surface of that, and I'm proud of that was kind of that first maybe start of that, in terms of looking at QoL, because when I go back to my literature review, not seeing a lot, if any, studies looking at QoL specifically in the Philippines, specifically grounded at looking at unhoused population, street dwellers. So I'm glad to humbly kind of start on that track and start to look at that, and hopefully be a start to a continuation of papers like mine, and dissertations like mine.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. The next thing that comes to my mind also is, do we really know that satisfaction as developed in the scale would be comparable to a Filipino definition of satisfaction? And then we really get into, as you talked about, skimming the surface of a Filipino psychology. Satisfaction can be defined culturally in many, many different ways. And I wonder if the satisfaction they were reporting would be recognizable or even relevant to your scale. So I'm thinking that developing perceptions of satisfaction from a Filipino cultural standpoint would pretty much be in order, I think, even in your chapter 1, as you look for context, for even rationale for why you even chose the scale. We know that there haven't been studies, and the scale hasn't been primed for Tagalog, but we don't know why. Could there be a reason for this that we haven't discovered? There wasn't one, so I wonder why that is. Is it the wrong question? Is it the wrong scale? Is it the wrong way to measure how people perceive their situation when there's housing insecurity? So these questions still remain even after your study is completed.
Yeah. Yes.
Dr. Coyne, I just want, can I respond to what you just?
Yes.
No, it's not my defense, but I'm just wondering, right, that the social and cultural constructs, right, or how that those words, satisfaction, for example, I'm thinking, and I don't speak Tagalog well, but I understand Tagalog fluently. So the only phrase that I can think of satisfaction is linked to spirituality and religion. There's this phrase, bahala na, which is like, it's up to God, right? For my quality of, like, if there's not a good translation, right? There's not a good translation from Tagalog to English of like, do I have life satisfaction? Because the Filipino people are typically Catholic. They're Roman Catholic, right? And religious people. And so the quality of life is not just from a Filipino context, it's not the quality of life for you. It is also that deterministic viewpoint of like, because I've done all of these things to lead a life of through faith in God, then I am afforded the satisfaction. So it's a complicated, so that's a question, right? It's very complicated, I would say. But I think in a chapter 2 or a chapter 1, to making it clear that this is this scale or whatever, but some words or language or context of what the Filipino context might give a little bit more, foundational, that international psychology foundational underpinnings to Dominique's studies. So
I thank you, Dr. Perez. I would agree with that. And at the end of the day, we're looking for inclusion, right? We're looking for relevance for the study to be housed somewhere. And we do, it's our responsibility to make sure we're using the terminology that's recognizable by a larger international community. So I really like your first recommendation to link it to the wider United Nations standard. And part of that is using a lingua franca, quite frankly, and, to be able to articulate the study in terms of what's recognizable and understandable, but then within the dissertation, contextualize it to the Filipino experience. So there's almost a double translation that has to happen, Dominique, even as early as chapter 1, to explain ahead of time the importance of, first of all, the importance of your study and the importance of understanding your data in a contextual way, because we're going to be interpreting your data not only in a scholarly sense, but we also have to have it make sense for those who are consuming it, or those who would consider legislation changes based on your data. So the question of translation comes up over and over again, not just translation for words, but how to contextualize and bring meaning to your findings. So I think going back to your chapters 1 and 2 would be as important as finishing out your chapter 5.
Absolutely. No, and thank you for bringing that to my attention. I think in conversations and as I've done my feedback edits, as I've received those from Father Gerald and from Dr. Perez, I've had a new, not newfound, but new, kind of passion and realization of like, the importance of religion in terms of the cultural context in the Philippines and with the Filipino people and how significant that is. And that's why I'm so thankful that I've had this partnership with the Dissertation Foundation and Father John and Father Gerald. So I was able to, more recently, even in my edits of my chapters, talk more about religion and faith-based, the significance of that. And highlighting something Dr. Perez said, and you as well, Dr. Coyne, as far as satisfaction. Really, my study, I feel like, if anything, drives home that satisfaction is not singularly defined. And especially in this context, it cannot be defined by what we would understand in a Western sense, or even in what the UN would understand it, or how the WHO would understand it. It is defined and understood in the the unique context of the Philippines. and in an Asian culture. So that was definitely a major takeaway for me in my results and the way I understood it. And the word satisfaction is so subjective. It may not even have a translatable, physical, translatable word. So that is something I took away from my research and my findings big time.
And you can say that. I mean, you can say that in your writing, that this word, although it's in, this is from a Western lens, or whatever you want to say, an individualistic culture, and there is contextual, there's contextualization of the understanding of this word all over the, in different contexts, communities, and cultures, right? And then you go into the Philippines, or maybe there's different translations in other parts of the world of what this means, but it's complicated because language, right? Each language is not side by side too, right? Like the word, I mean, we're talking about satisfaction, but like really any word. I mean, I guess the closest would be like European languages, but when you start going into like African, you start going to Asian, you start, and even just characters, it's hard. I mean, it's really hard. So I'm really encouraged, Dominique, that you upon reflection, you're realizing all this. And of course, we're lifelong learners, right?
Absolutely. As I took it away, I laughed with Dr. Coyne. I said, I did come away with, some answers, but I came away with a whole bunch of questions at the conclusion of this, which is a good thing, but yeah, I came away with a ton more questions. So I think that my research highlighted that, and I'm glad to be a part of additional questioning and additional learning. So.
That's the right attitude. And I'm so pleased. I'm so pleased that we've been able to do this journey, because it takes a very robust dissertation student to be put through the ringer, not only with a study like this, but with this line of questioning, and especially with having Dr. Perez on your committee. So I'm also laughing, Dominique, because I remember at the beginning of the study, you and I were going back and forth about housing. Like there are so many definitions of homelessness, and which are you going to use, and what has significance, and housing this, housing that. Does it mean living in a boat? Does it mean living on a college campus when there's no classes in session? And the definition is comfortably wide. And it also made me think, well, if we're using temporary housing as a definition, if we're including this in homelessness, this is going to, add to the non-significance. So, maybe even sub-slicing and dicing the sample a little bit farther might have allowed you to arrive at some other conclusions. But at the same time, how many more times can we, reanalyze quantitative data? We could keep slicing and dicing, looking for significance, or we can just, take a macro lens and just look at what we have and let that lead our further directions in terms of questioning and inquiry.
Absolutely.
All right. I think I'm finished with my questioning. Dr. Luter,
Yes.
how are we doing with time? I have a feeling that we're over time.
We are a bit over time, but I did want to open it up for 1 minute or so if there are any questions or comments from the general public. So does anyone have any additional questions or comments today? James, go ahead.
When you did your research via the Zoom, was it difficult not to connect with the persons or the people or the group or the culture like we would do in say if we're right in front of them? How did that connection was relevant to you? I mean, to really sense the questions you were asking, the answers you're receiving. I heard what you were saying was fantastic, but for me, if I did a Zoom, it would be kind of difficult just to do that, but I'm learning from you.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, James. I'm gonna be honest, like in a kind of like experimental way, like I was really excited to really voyage on a virtual dissertation and data collection. I had, maybe talked to previous cohort, friends of mine, and, it wasn't really something that was done. And then obviously COVID-19 at its height, so many things were closed and canceled, and, travel was very limited. So, really, born out of that, partial necessity and partial, curiosity on my own part as a researcher, I was really excited by the fact and the potential to do a fully virtual study. While it's not uncommon or new, in my, this being my first dissertation, it definitely was new to me, and definitely a new experience, but I welcome the challenge of that. As far as connection, I think obviously with anything, as we've learned, through COVID and beyond, there is a bit of subjective and built-in uncomfort and disconnect with being behind a computer screen, and being, yes, you can virtually see me via video, but there is the natural barrier of you're in a different place, I'm in a different place. And then adding on to the fact that I, speak English, I don't speak Tagalog, knowing other, other than a few terms. So adding that as an additional barrier, communication and language. So while those were barriers, I am thankful that I did have, video feed and the ability to, hear and kind of not physically be in the surroundings, but at least see it and kind of understand, spatial things and things of that nature. And again, also open to, cues that I may have missed, but in general, still being able to see so much. So I am thankful for that, and thankful that I had that form of connection, and really just glad to kind of have the experience of this is what a virtual study could look like, and be successful. I had very minimal technological issues or connection issues, so thankful for that.
Thank you. I appreciate
Thank
that.
you. Great question.
Thank you, James. Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you all so very much. Dominic, thank you for a fascinating study. It was just such an honor to listen to your study and the work that you've done. I can't wait to hear more and see what your next steps will be.